So in part B of chapter 5, now that we have talked about what it means to be a eukaryote, we're going to specifically focus on this list. So we're going to look at fungi, algae, protozoans, and parasitic worms or helminths. And so these are the 4 types of microbes that we're going to look at this semester that are eukaryotes. So just right out of the gate, what do all of these have in common? Well, they're all eukaryotes, which means they all have a true nucleus. They all have those membrane-bound organelles that we just talked about in the previous section. So we know what they have in common. Now, let's look at their basic characteristics and figure out what makes them all unique to their own specific category. So we'll start with kingdom fungi. So fungi being the plural form, fungus obviously being the singular. And so when we talk about kingdom fungi, just a couple of basic characteristics we want to mention. First off, typically they are unicellular. So typically fungi, very small, single-celled organisms. They can be in small groups. The cells for a fungus are contained within a cell wall. Remember, we mentioned previously the cell wall of fungi is made of chitin, typically, very strong polysaccharide, which again makes it very difficult to kill them. When we talk about fungi, you basically can divide this kingdom into 2 groups, the macroscopic fungi and the microscopic fungi. Obviously the difference here, macro being the large, very visible fungus, so this is going to be like mushrooms, puffballs. You've probably seen this outside. You used to squish them and stuff would shoot out from them. Gill fungi that you can find growing on trees and things like that. And then, of course, microscopic fungi. So this is the stuff that you cannot see visibly without magnification. And so typically, we're either going to see microscopic fungi in hyphae form, which is where you're going to find like your molds, or then in yeast form, which is a very round, oval, very small shaped organism, and we use that, you think yeast, we use that like bread, that kind of stuff. Okay, so if we go into a little more detail, again, here's the hyphae form. So these are what molds consist of, and when they say hyphae, they're telling you that the cells that make up molds they're not these circular things you're used to seeing when you think about a cell. They're actually these long thread-like structures. And inside of here is where you'd find all of their organelles. And so this network is what makes mold look like this. It's also one of the reasons I think that a lot of people confuse fungus as to being a plant. Because when you see a structure like this, you think, oh, well, that's branches like a tree. Well, then this must be a plant, right? But definitely not a plant for some other very specific reasons. One being chitinous cell wall. But some other things that kind of make them different we'll look at in just a moment. The other typical microscopic fungi we see are yeast. So these are the round structures we're used to thinking of with cells, very oval shaped. They typically do asexual reproduction, and they typically reproduce by budding. So just basically part of the cell just kind of buds away, separates itself from the cell, and becomes a whole new organism. So that's what we see when we look at yeast. Now, I mentioned a lot of people confuse fungi with plants just because of the way they look, but one of the reasons we know that fungus is different than plant has to do with nutrition. So as far as fungi are concerned, they are heterotrophs. Now, if you don't know what that word means, it actually comes from the root word that means others feeder. Plants are what we call autotrophs. They're self-feeders. They have the ability to generate energy just by absorbing nutrients from the atmosphere. Whereas heterotrophs have to actually consume another living thing in order to get nutrition. So fungus cannot stand in the sunlight and make energy, make food. They have to actually consume something else. Typically, they consume dead materials, which is why they're considered to be saprobes. Now, one of the things I need you to be mindful of with fungi is that they're typically not parasitic. You know, fungi get a bad rap, but most fungi are free-living. They only become parasitic when the event arises, when it becomes when the opportunity kind of sets itself up. Okay, so they use the term to say that they're not obligate, meaning they don't have to have a host, but they're opportunistic in the way of, well, I mean, if all conditions are favorable, then okay, I'll cause an infection. Now, one interesting thing to note, though, is we said they have to consume another living thing. Well, obviously fungi don't have a mouth, and so the way they consume is they secrete enzymes. The enzymes break down the food material, and then they absorb those into their cells. So you think about fungal infections like athlete's foot, and then of course, like mold that you see growing on fruit. Again, they typically reproduce with spores, and interestingly enough, a lot of people think they have allergies to plants and to pollen, but what they actually have allergies to are the blooming of fungal spores, which happens about the same time that plants bloom, and so if you actually had an allergy test, you probably would find that you're more allergic to fungus than you are actually to plants. So as far as the importance of fungi, so we look at two categories here with their roles in the environment. The first category we look at their adverse impacts, and then we look at how they're beneficial. So adversely, we know that they can cause infections, right? They're called mycoses. We know that they typically are free-living, but they can be opportunistic. We just mentioned that they can trigger allergies, right? And then of course we know that fungi can completely wipe out a crop. It can also destroy our food, right? So those are kind of the negative impacts of fungi. But the beneficial side just simply says, well, first off, we know that they can help to stabilize plant roots. There are certain types of fungus that will grow on plant root systems and help those plants to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. We also know that fungi can be used to derive antibiotics. We know they're used in the making of alcohol. Also can be used as vitamins. We've already mentioned they are decomposers. They're saprobes, so they help to recycle nutrients. And then, of course, we know that we can use them in foods as well. So fungi, although they get a bad rap about the negative impacts, they also can be very, very useful to us in our everyday lives. So that's fungus. I put this chart up, not that you're going to see these terms on your test, but just to kind of give you an idea of some of the more common fungal infections that we see. And by the way, ringworm, not a worm, it's an actual fungus. So the second category we're going to look at in this section are the protists. Now, one of the things that they mention is the term protist. So this is kind of your catch-all category. In other words, when they were going through and organizing using taxonomy and classification, they determined that some species were similar to plants, but weren't quite plants. They were similar to animals, but they weren't quite animals. They were similar to fungus, but they weren't quite fungus, and so instead, they put them in a catch-all category that we call protists. All right, and so inside of this category we have both algae and protozoans. Things that we know about algae, we know that of course they are eukaryotes. They're typically unicellular, and one key thing to know about algae is that they have chlorophyll, which gives them the ability to do photosynthesis. So that's kind of a key thing about algae that you don't see in these other types of eukaryotes. For protozoans, typically again unicellular. But we're going to see some differences here than we see in some of these other ones. Again, algae are photosynthetic. They have a cell wall. We already talked about the composition varies. And then they may have flagella. They may not. When I think algae, I usually think of like seaweed or pond scum, that stuff that they'll develop on the top of the swimming pool, the green stuff that you see in the summer. Again, typically free living. They typically don't cause problems for us, although during certain algae bloom seasons, they can cause incidents like the red tides, where they suck a lot of oxygen out of the ocean water and it kills a lot of fishes. So definitely can be a problem in that sense. Just some pictures here of algae. The other group that we see under protist or protista are the protozoans. They typically lack a cell wall, so that's a key component here. Unlike algae, though, they are heterotrophs, so they don't have chloroplasts, which means they're going to have to feed off of other living things to get nutrients. When they're first forming, they have what's called an ectoplasm and an endoplasm. The ectoplasm typically becomes all of the external features. Endoplasm typically becomes the gut and the internal features. And then a key thing to know about protozoans is that they typically have appendages for locomotion. So these are ones that may have flagella, the whip-like tail, they may have cilia, those short hair-like structures, or they may have pseudopods. And if you remember from biology, that's the fake feet that they're able to extend from their body. And so you see here, there's your cilia, there's your flagella, and then these would be pseudopods that extend around material to engulf it or to help them move. Protozoans typically are found in two life forms. So the trophozoite is their motile feeding stage. This is when they're most active. And then they have the cyst stage where they actually go dormant and survive unfavorable conditions. So it's kind of like the endospore that some bacteria can do, except it's called a cyst here with protozoans. And you can kind of see life cycle with those. And then as far as medical importance here, you can see some of the more common protozoan pathogens that lead to infectious diseases. I will just point out Giardia is a big problem in parts of the world. Plasmodium vivax, that's the one that causes malaria. Toxoplasma gondii, that's the one that's associated with cat feces and pregnant women not being exposed to that because it can lead to birth defects. And then this guy right here is what we call the brain-eating amoeba. So definitely some high impact protozoans that we hear about in the news right now. And so the last one that we look at in the chapter are the helminths. A couple things I did want to mention here. First off, be mindful. I recognize that worms are not microbes, right? Worms are very visible without using some form of magnification. So the question I always get is, well, why in the world are we talking about worms in microbiology? Two reasons. One, their larvae are typically microscopic. So the way they begin their life is as a microorganism. And then the other reason we want to talk about them is that we know that there's a group of them that are parasitic. And so we want to talk about them when we talk about infectious diseases. So a couple things to note about helminths. Of course, they're eukaryotes. They're multicellular. And actually, they're very similar to us in organization. They have mouth parts for attachment and digestion. They have well-developed sex organs used to produce egg and sperm cells. Fertilize eggs, go through a larval period, and then eventually mature into an adult form. And so you can kind of see some different images that we have here of kind of how their basic structure looks. And so when we talk about parasitic helminths, they basically have two categories that we're going to look at. Okay, so we have the flatworms and the roundworms. If we look at flatworms, their fancy name is Platyhelminthes. I always tell students, just remember plat rhymes with flat, right? They're called flatworms because they are very flat. Typically, they're very thin. You can kind of see through them. They don't have an actual body cavity because they are so flat. And this contains things like cestodes and trematodes. So cestodes are going to be your tapeworms. Trematodes are going to be flukes, like blood flukes, liver flukes. Again, very thin and flat. So here you can see a picture of a tapeworm. Here you can see a picture of a fluke. Okay. Roundworms or nematodes are the other category, and of course they're called roundworms because they are round, right? So where flatworms are very, very flat, paper thin, these are going to have a little bit more to them. They actually have a body cavity, thicker, round, and these are going to be things that we typically associate, like if you ever had a dog that had heartworms, then they had roundworms, right? Or intestinal worms be a common one that we see with them. It's interesting to note that they actually did a study, and a large percentage of children actually have roundworms in their system. They just didn't know it, right? And so definitely something, it's a bigger problem than a lot of people are aware of. One of the things we note about worms is they have a 3-stage life cycle. So they have the fertilized egg, they have the larval stage, and then they have adult stage. They also typically use multiple hosts, so you have a intermediate host, a definitive host, and then you have the transport host that kind of goes in between. And so the interesting thing with helminths is treating them becomes a little bit difficult because you're treating several different life stages, right? So you got the fertilized egg that really doesn't move, you get the larval that starts to move and kind of go from one host to the next, and then of course you've got the very motile reproductive adult stage. And so in treating them, it's a little bit more difficult because you're trying to treat these different stages of their life cycle. So this just kind of walks you through how someone would acquire a pinworm and then what it actually have to go through in order to spread to someone else, and you can kind of see it from the picture that's here.